Hello, everyone. It's me again, Priscilla Magrath, Senior Lecturer in the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona. And now, for the moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to talk about qualitative data analysis. So perhaps the first question is, what is analysis? And I think it's really important to remember that analysis means data reduction. So there's a tendency with qualitative research to gather this mass of data, and we think everything's important, and we always think our research is terribly important, which it is, but you have to learn sometimes to be a little bit brutal and sort of reduce that data and make it manageable for somebody else who hasn't been to that setting, who hasn't done or is not as familiar with the data. So you've got to develop this instinct for getting to the heart of the matter and prioritizing and data reduction, because if you go through the whole analysis process and you end up with 1,000 codes or 300 quotations, you're not really helping the reader or the general public to understand the significance of your research. So analysis is about making sense of the data. So again, if you end up with an analysis that is incomprehensible to the average person, that's not really analysis. You have to be simplifying the data as well as reducing it. So analysis is a process of moving from description to an explanation. Even if we're not doing quantitative, we're not necessarily building theory, but we want to move beyond description. Otherwise, it might as well be a newspaper article or a travelogue or a journal. We want to go beyond that to explain what is going on, to find significance in the data so that we can answer the inevitable "so what" question. So let's remind ourselves, I brought this out in module 1, that qualitative research, what we're looking for is an insight rather than a generalization, and the meaning of a behavior, not a report of it. So the most important issue is the explanatory value, the richness. Now, when you're collecting data or when you're analyzing it, you may suddenly get an aha moment that finally you get what's going on. You can understand why people behave like this. And that's what you're trying to get at. So when does analysis start? Well, this is one of the differences possibly with quantitative, is that basically as soon as the data collection starts, or even before, when you're designing, you're already thinking about, what am I going to say? What do I want to be able to say at the end? What might be interesting themes to explore? And so the analysis process is ongoing and it's iterative. You're always cycling around. So that's why it's really important to keep notes, not only on what you observe, what you found, but also the development of your ideas, that you may find an issue that you hadn't anticipated becomes important. So when I was doing my doctoral research in Indonesia, it was only, when I'd done a couple of months of field work that I realized that the right to health was going to be an important theme for me because of the way that people talked about it, how important it was to them. And so that was never in my proposal or anything. So that kind of thing needs to be recorded, and it becomes part of your sort of audit trail. So after each phase of data collection, now you may be doing data collection on your own, or you may be in a team, but either way, you need some kind of regular debriefing where you take a pause, maybe once a month, once a week, maybe each day if you're in the field collecting data. Just try to make sense of the data, what's going on, what are we getting so far, any surprises, perhaps there's something we need to add to our questionnaire, something we didn't anticipate. Research is supposed to be a process of discovery, so you have to allow for that and not just mechanically continue doing what you were doing before. And so another question for qualitative research is, what do we actually mean by data? Because we're not dealing with numbers necessarily. Well, we may be as well, but what we want to emphasize here is it's not just the transcripts from your interviews and focus groups. Notes taken during observations or during your focus group, notes from your debriefing sessions, recorded thoughts, memos, and ideas. All of this is important and needs to be included in your audit trail, and it can be included one way or another in the analysis. There are many ways of using memos and field notes in your analysis. So let's move on to thematic analysis, which broadly there are many different terms: content analysis, thematic, and various other adjectives added to it. But let's take thematic analysis as a broad umbrella term. May have different meanings in different disciplines and so on, but we just mean that you're breaking the data down. What is a theme? You're breaking up your flow of data. You know, when you're doing qualitative data, you're often observing or trying to understand everyday life, which is a continuous flow, right? It's not divided into little categories where every few seconds things stop and you get a still or something. It's a continuous process. So what you're doing with the theme is you're kind of breaking up that continuous process into meaningful chunks, okay? Some piece of information could be a word, a phrase, a picture, something that has meaning. Okay, and a really useful way to think about it is to ask the question, what is this an example of? A theme is an example of something, okay? So this comes to a slightly tricky question, which is, well, what happens if you come across something that's very interesting, but there's only one occurrence? Then is it a theme? Well, typically, no, it's not going to be a theme, because a theme needs to connect across different observations or different phenomena or something like that. So if we do go back to our very simple example of a study of what do people do in the library, okay, and we only have one case where people, you know, bring their lunch in or something like that, then it's questionable whether that is a theme. I mean, we can still ask the question, what does this occurrence tell us? Maybe it's interesting to ask, well, why is this the only case? And that would be a case of missing data. You know, why don't more people bring their lunch into the library or whatever it is? But it's a bit questionable to use it as a theme for coding your data. Doesn't mean you can't use it or mention it. So where do themes come from? And this is a very important distinction to be clear about. Because you're going to need to say this when you write up your qualitative research. Is it deductive or is it inductive? Now, neither of these are terms we use in everyday language, so it's easy to get them muddled up. So deductive means you start from a theory or a questionnaire, and basically you're using your research to kind of look at, for example, the incidence of a particular category. So in our library research, we may say, well, we've come up with a list of all the possible things that a student could possibly do in the library. And so those are going to be our themes, and then we'll organize everything around that. Okay. Now, the different from that is the kind of opposite of that is inductive. And that means ideally, or in theory, you just go into the data with an open mind and let the data speak. So the themes will emerge from the data. And this fits very well with exploratory research or new discovery, and can lead to developing theory. Now, we are human beings, we come with our ideas. Is it realistic to claim that you went in with a completely open mind? Probably not. You've got your theories in the back of your mind, but the idea is that you set that aside and you try to see what comes out of the data. How can you tell if it's inductive? Well, if it wasn't in the theory or the questionnaire, if it's something new, then you can say that it's inductive. We never anticipated that people would be doing weightlifting in the library or something like that. That didn't even occur to us before we started. Okay, so it's very important to emphasize that even if you're doing deductive, and certainly if you're doing inductive, familiarization with the data is really important. What does that mean? You don't just read your transcript once. You listen to the recording, you go through it again and again. You basically try to expose yourself to the data as much as possible so that you become very familiar with it. Now, you might have a very large data set. You might have a team of researchers. You just have to do whatever is practical. But the more time you spend familiarizing yourself with the data first, then all these subsequent stages are going to be easier and better, more reliable. Your validity, your reliability, they will all be strengthened. If you only have a superficial relationship with your data, then all of the other stages in the analysis are going to be weak, okay? And the other thing to say is you will hardly ever find completely deductive or completely inductive with qualitative research. It's just a question of degree. Okay, so let's say that you have done your research and you've come up with lots of themes. We've got a long list of things that people do in the library. Now, what do we do with that? Well, again, you're doing analysis. You're not just describing. You have to move beyond a list. A list is rather boring. I don't find lists very interesting when I read an article with a list or anything with a long list. After a while, you switch off. So how can we make this list do a bit more work for us? We have to look at relationships between the themes. You can use diagrams, you can use hierarchies, you can do whatever you like, flowcharts and Venn diagrams, but what you're interested in, the analysis, the next step of analysis, moving beyond a list, would be to explore relationships. And again, it's often better to do this in a team, to have some brainstorming, think of all the different ways you can organize the themes. And at the end of the day, there are many ways. So which is the best way? Well, the best way, it should be guided by your research question. Go back to the research question. What are you really interested in? Of all the different ways of organizing the material, what are you interested in? That question also, you might sort of think, well, at what point should we bring theory in? Well, again, that all depends on what you're interested in and what you want to be able to say at the end of the day. And then data reduction, again, not hundreds of themes, but what are the most important themes? And that's where the hierarchies often come in. You may identify some meta themes, some overarching themes. So in the library research, we may say, well, there are work related, student work related, and then there are non-work related. So that would be a meta theme, and then under that, all the other things. So very briefly, let's go through the steps that you take in thematic analysis. And there are articles and books written about this. But basically, what are the steps? What are you going to be doing step by step? First of all, the themes that you identified and you looked at the relationships, they become codes. And you organize the codes into a code book. Now, the code book should reflect all that work that you did looking at relationships. That should determine the order and also the hierarchy of the code book, with meta themes and sub themes under it and all that sort of thing. Now, very, very important. And remember, you don't want hundreds of codes because every single code needs a very clear definition. You have to identify, what does this code mean? What are the inclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria? What are some examples? Not, maybe what you think is obvious would not be obvious to another person. You have to make everything explicit so that there could be no doubt at all about what this code is talking about. And that's important because the next step is to link each piece of data to a code. And that's where things may start getting messy. You sort of think, well, this bit of data good, does it go with this code or that code? Really, it fits in both. And then you have to say, well, maybe I can code it with both. And then when you start linking data, linking the codes to the data, that is when the ambiguities come up, and you have to go back and say, well, really, we need to redefine what we mean by student work, or we need to redefine what we mean by the library, or, you know, the most basic terms for your research. And that's part of the fun and part of the interesting thing, is that all the time it's this iterative process of getting closer to a clear explanation of what is going on. Okay, so then this can be a very laborious process. Now, again, the more work you put into constructing a really good code book, the less time you'll take later on in each stage. So it's almost as though at each stage, the more investment you make at each stage, the easier it will be at the subsequent stage. So you put a lot of time into thinking about the codes, a lot of time into the code book. Once you've got a really good code book, it's kind of, you know, there are subsequent steps are going to be relatively easy. The problems arrive when the code book isn't clear, or it isn't well developed, or you haven't done enough analysis. And then the coding is not going to involve enough data reduction. You're not going to get those clear messages about what the data is saying. So once you've coded all of your data with one or more codes, bearing in mind that if you don't link your data, let's say you have a paragraph and you say, well, it doesn't really fit any of those codes, fine. But when you get to the next stage, which is retrieving the data, that won't be retrieved. So what you're saying goodbye to that data, basically. Because the whole point of building the code book and coding is that you're never going to have to go back to the original data. You're only going to be using the coded data. Okay, so think carefully. Why did I collect this data? Why did this person talk about this if it's not relevant to any code that I'm interested in? So again, you might say, well, maybe we need to add a code. Maybe we need to change the definition of the code because this is important. I don't want to throw it out, but it doesn't fit any of the pre-existing codes. Okay, so once all your data is coded, and you can visualize that in your head as, you know, if different colors for different codes, you know, and then you're going to get this text with all these multicolored codes. The next step is to retrieve data according to the codes. So all the data that falls under one code can be retrieved and then analyzed again. And all the data from another code, or maybe, and then you compare the two. So you're doing more comparison, building models and all that sort of thing. So this is why even the very simplest question, such as what do students do in the library, it can get quite complicated when you get to this stage. So how many coders? This is a question I get asked a lot, because as doctoral students, you know, you don't have a budget and you're often doing research on your own. So how important is it to have more than one person analyzing that data? Well, there are lots of benefits. So it is highly recommended to use at least one other coder. You can just imagine all that brainstorming that we've been talking about, building your code book, defining codes. You know, two heads are better than one. You're going to end up with probably a better code book. And then when you start coding, it does improve reliability, because, you know, if each coder is coding in exactly the same way, it shows the code is clear. And there are ways of measuring intercoder reliability. So you sort of say, well, you know, we want to get to 60%, 70%, 90%, okay, to show that we're all coding the same way. So it's a strong code book. It also improves the validity. Do the codes represent a real phenomenon out there? If every coder can find the same thing in the data, then it's probably a real thing in the data. It improves code definition. You all have to agree, much discussion involved. What exactly do we mean by work, the library, whatever it is, hand washing? And it also improves the consistency of coding, because you're all going to have to sit down and agree, well, do I code by sentence? Do I code by paragraph? You know, how chunky? There are lots of little rules that you need to agree on, and that makes it more consistent. Okay, now what you've all been waiting for, the big question, when to use software. Well, I've embedded that question in what I think is a more important question, really, which is what do you want to be able to say? And for that question, I'm always recommending that you think ahead to what you want to say in your final write-up and then work backwards so that your codebook design reflects your final write-up. And that'll make those final stages a lot easier, because by the time you've done your analysis effectively, you have, your meta themes will be subheads, and, you've already more or less designed the write-up. Now, why am I leaving it so late to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the software? Decades ago, everything would have been done manually. You would have taken your written transcripts and taken different colored pens or post-it notes or something like that. So all I can say, my key message here, if you go back to these themes, you could start using your software very early on. Certainly, you could bring the data into your software before you even start familiarizing yourself with the data. Okay. And then you could build your code book in the software as you go along, and then do all the other stages. However, the important thing to remember is that the software is not doing the analysis for you. It can only make the process more efficient, more powerful, and faster. So it's not a good idea to rely too much on the software. And in my class, we do a lot of the codebook development and analysis with a whiteboard and pens and discussion and bits of paper and so on. And then, when you get to a certain stage, you put it into MaxQDA, and then certainly coding the data is going to be a lot quicker in MaxQDA, and retrieving segments and those things. So why do I say MaxQDA? That is the software that I use in my course, and I cannot really speak about other software you may already have experience of, NVivo or Atlas TI or Deduce. I'm only going to talk about MaxQDA very briefly. We get a free course license for my course. It is very intuitive, and there are many instruction videos and training guides and things like that. But when I say it's intuitive, what I'm referring to is the 4 windows. That's what it's famous for. Maybe other programs have that as well. So, you've got the top left window. You're going to bring in your data, which could be of many, many formats, and could be videos or transcripts or focus group or whatever. And then the next one is your code book. So you can see them all at once, the data, the code book. And then on the top right, you can draw up your individual item, like one interview, when you're looking for codes or something like that. And then the 4th window, you're retrieving segments. So you've already coded the data, and then you bring the segments in, and you can look at them, do all sorts of fancy things with them. That's a very brief introduction. And I know I've only skimmed the surface, and my goal in this presentation has been really to highlight things to consider. There's a lot of textbooks out there, a lot of articles, a lot of software programs, a lot of training materials, but this is just a very brief introduction to some of the things you might want to consider. And if you want to learn more, there's a little bit of information here about my Qualitative Research Methods class. I teach it every spring, and it's very in-person. It's very interactive and collaborative. So we discuss a lot of these issues. It is required for the PhD in health behavior, health promotion, highly recommended for the DRPH in family and child health. It's available to all graduates across the university. So in this course, you will implement a qualitative research project with your peers. The first half of the semester is data collection and theory, and the second half, data analysis. And we just get as far as we can in the class. And just very finally, this is a very useful resource that I have also drawn on in this presentation, Ryan and Bernard, Techniques to Identify Themes. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in my class next spring. Thank you very much.